Hi, thank you for joining us for our conversation with artists Annabel Soutar and J.R. Jamison. I'm Tori Allen, President and CEO of Arts Midwest. At Arts Midwest, we strive to support and celebrate creativity across our 9-state region, as well as the native nations that share the same geography. To meet this moment and to address the tremendous challenges and opportunities facing us, we also recognize the importance of amplifying the creativity of artists and partners beyond our borders. We, like our partners at the Quebec Delegation and Indiana Humanities, believe in the power of creativity to create thriving, entrepreneurial, and welcoming communities, which is why we're so thrilled to be able to convene tonight's conversation, a true creative exchange between two North American cultural leaders who are harnessing storytelling and documentary theater to help us connect across differences and confront today's political polarization. On a housekeeping note, please send in your questions via the Q&A feature. We want to hear from you. Annabel and J.R. will try to incorporate your answers into their questions into tonight's event. We're also recording tonight's event and plan to share it with you by the end of this week. And before we hand it over to JR and Annabel, I would like to introduce Kareth Iverson with the Quebec Government Office in Chicago, who, through their generous financial support, made tonight's conversation possible. Thank you and welcome, Kareth.
Thank you, Tori, for the warm introduction. Our office is committed to connecting communities in the Midwest with Quebecois artists. We have been a proud supporter of Arts Midwest for several decades and will continue to promote a diverse offering of performing arts for decades to come. We are excited to share with you a series of programming developed with Arts Midwest to showcase artists from Quebec and their efforts to challenge and process global events through creative platforms. Tonight, we are joined by Annabel Soutar, a Montreal-based playwright and theater producer who co-founded Parole Productions in 2000 with actor Alex Ivanovich. She, along with the company, are dedicated to documentary theater that creates a transformational sense of civic engagement in its audiences. She has written 8 documentary plays, including Seeds, Sexy Béton, The Watershed, and Freddie. Her recent work includes co-authoring The Assembly, a devised series of documentary plays exploring the phenomenon of political polarization, the subject of our discussion today. Annabel will be in conversation with J.R. Jamison, the author of Hillbilly Queer and the founder of the Facing Project, a national organization that creates a more understanding and empathetic world through stories that inspire action. J.R. is also a co-host of the Facing Project radio show on NPR. His work has been featured in The Guardian, Harlem World Magazine, The Huffington Post, and numerous literary journals. J.R. lives in Indiana with his husband, Corey, and their dog, JJ. A brief reminder to send in your questions via the Q&A feature anytime during tonight's conversation, and our guests will read them throughout the evening. Enjoy the conversation, and JR, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tori and Kareth, for that warm introduction. And Annabel, I am so excited for this moment. We've waited for this for a few weeks now, and yes, I'm excited to be in conversation with you.
I am too. This is a lovely opportunity. Thank you.
And I also want to add, JJ, who was mentioned in my bio, my dog, is in the next room. And I think people are probably used to this by now. But if you hear barking, that's just our beloved JJ. So I apologize in advance for that.
It could happen in my household as well. Charlotte is just upstairs and sometimes will join me.
Ah, perfect. I want to start with a question. Some of our watchers and listeners may not necessarily know the motto of Port Parole, and especially the Assembly. Can you share briefly how that motto operates?
Sure. Well, first of all, Port Parole Productions is dedicated to the creation and production of documentary theater. So some of your listeners might already be aware of that form of theater. Actually, it's a genre that I discovered in the United States. I was born in Montreal and went to high school here, but I actually attended Princeton University in the early 90s. And I was fortunate enough to come across the work of 2 very important American documentary playwrights and directors. Anna DeVere Smith, who's the author of, amongst many other plays, Twilight and Fires in the Mirror, 2 documentary plays about racial conflicts in the United States. And Emily Mann, who was at the time that I was studying at Princeton, the artistic director of the McCarter Theater in the town of Princeton. And her plays like Still Life and Execution of Justice, I discovered while studying at Princeton. So Port Parole, all the plays that I have written as a playwright and that Port Parole produces are verbatim documentary plays. The texts are all based on interviews that we do with real people that are then transcribed and sort of used to sculpt a work of theater. And that language is given to professional actors to perform on the stage. So all of our productions have been that. The piece of theater that I think we're going to focus on tonight, because it deals with political polarization, is a specific approach to documentary theater that I call devised documentary theater. It's called The Assembly. And instead of going out into the world and following a story like I've done in some of my other plays, this one actually creates the conditions to record 4 people who come together to have supper, who are absolutely opposed in their politics. In general, there are 2 people who really are more left-leaning and 2 people who are more right-leaning. We get a diversity of age and gender and socioeconomic background, sexual orientation, and we invite them to have supper. We record the language of that supper. We edit that language into a script, and then professional actors are asked to come and perform that text as a piece of theater. So we created this model because we were particularly concerned with polarization in North America and around the world. And the project is not just one play, it's a series of plays that we create over and over again using that same model. We've done 2 of these in Montreal, one with French people and one with English Montrealers. We've been to Germany, to Sao Paulo, Brazil, and to the United States. And actually, the project was inspired very much by what's happened in your country politically over the past 5 years.
Mm. The Facing Project model is somewhat similar. If folks aren't familiar with that, we also invite 2 people to sit down together, but through acts of what we call acts of empathy, which is listening and writing. They write each other's stories from each other's perspectives. And they're doing that along with multiple other people in the same community on the same topic. Sometimes that may be on poverty, sometimes that may be on ability or autism, sometimes that may be on political polarization, but it's sharing those stories, writing from each other's point of view, and then those are all compiled into a book and shared throughout the community and through conversations and listening circles, and sometimes brought on stage through theater, through monologues. And so
yeah, and I guess what there is in common between ours is that sometimes the stories are taken out of the mouths of the people who say them and they're given to other people to speak. And so there's an act of listening going on that allows us to get some distance from the material.
Yeah, and especially sometimes I find people read their story afterward and they think, oh, that's not what I mean, or that's not who I am. And so there's a conversation that has to happen between listener, storyteller, writer about, well, tell me more about why you think this doesn't represent you. And those are some of those kind of aha moments. Can you share as well through theater how you've seen some of that transpire?
Well, I think one of the most interesting moments in the process of the assembly, well, there's several, but one of the ones that I love is when the actor confronts their role. So I'll give you an example. In the first ever assembly we did, there was a woman who's in her 70s who describes herself as alt-right, a populist, a Trump supporter, even though she's Canadian. There are many, this might be news to you Americans, but there are many Canadians who support Donald Trump and are very vocal about it in our country. Just because we're stereotyped as all being kind of socialists up here in Canada. And the actress who played her, we picked her because she resembled the woman physically. She was the same age and she had some of the same mannerisms, but she was absolutely left-wing, progressive, had a very different sort of upbringing, etc. And the moment when the actress had to defend her character and ask questions about where this ideology came from, was so meaningful because, as you just pointed out before, in some ways, the process is just an excuse to get people who think differently in the same space. And in the case of this actress, she actually took it a step further. We asked her, well, would you like to speak to the real person that you're playing with? This, we don't always do this with our plays. And she said, yes, I think it would help me if I could ask her a few questions about her background and where her ideology springs from. And they met a couple of times, and the real person came to see the play. And actually really loved the performance. So I feel that even though at the end of the day, I'm not going to be idealistic and say they both changed their minds or their politics, they were able to find the space to listen to each other and become curious about each other. And I think, when I look at the Facing project that you've done too, JR, it feels like that's what's engendered is the curiosity about our perspectives and our experiences that makes us stop for a moment and stop like hurling Molotov cocktails at each other, which is how I experience a lot of public discourse today. It's very violent.
Yeah, I do as well. We talk about, as I mentioned, acts of empathy, and most people say, oh, you're storytellers or you're writers, but really it's about the listening. That's the most important piece of this. And a byproduct of that listening is the story that then is told either on the page or in your case on the stage. And then there's this whole other dynamic of the audience experiencing what's happening in front of them in real-time emotions. And I understand too, in our earlier conversations, you have a little bit of participatory theater. Can you talk
Yes,
about what that looks like and how people react
for
to
sure.
some of these tough conversations or stories in the moment?
Yeah, because we call this moment within the assembly the long table discussion. And actually, it's not a talk back that happens after the play is over. We call it actually Act 2 of a 3-act play, in which the first moment of theater is the reenactment of the supper. And of course, the audience is experiencing all kinds of things during that supper. They're relating to certain characters. They're disgusted by how people are speaking to each other, and sometimes the failure of those people to listen. And then there's a moment when the play stops. Basically, it comes to an end or a semi-end, and one of the actors says, "We're now going to stop, and we're going to give the 6 places around the table because there are 4 participants and 2 moderators. We're going to give these 6 places up to you to have your own assembly for 20 minutes. And this comes as a surprise to the audience. They did not know that was going to happen. And of course, they've been launched into this space by what they saw happen on stage. There's always a moment of tension after the space is emptied and the audience is kind of looking at the empty table and everyone's wondering who's going to have the courage to go up there. And it's wonderful. Like, we've done this now all over the world, hundreds of times, and we've never had, an experience where no one has gone up to the table. And then, slowly the real people find themselves at the table. And they kind of first start reacting to what they saw on the stage, but then they realize that they have an opportunity to maybe correct some of the wrongs that they saw on stage. Sometimes they just speak very emotionally, like, I feel sad at how polarized we are, or, that conversation I just saw between those 4 people resembles my Thanksgiving dinner last year. Or people tell very personal anecdotes, but what's beautiful about it is that you find them sort of gently trying to find a way to speak to one another. And it's a very beautiful moment, and in some cases more theatrical than what preceded it. And I know for you too, in your projects, you have moments of spontaneous discussion that weren't prepared, right? And that often the piece that was prepared was just a springboard for people to come into a space and talk to one another. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And even in the initial conversation between writers and storytellers, the pairs, we'll often have during our training session with them, we'll get the question, well, is there a series or a list of questions you could provide to get our conversation started? And people are shocked when we say, no,
Yep.
there isn't. If you want an easy question, maybe talk about, oh, we live in the same city. Tell me how long you've lived here. Just to have some of those icebreakers, conversation starters, but ultimately you both know you're showing up in this space to talk about a specific topic.
For
So
sure.
really, we want you to have a conversation. How would you have a
Yeah,
conversation?
and we want you to lead it. That's
Yes.
interesting because we do that at the assembly. Some people have said to us, well, we didn't know how to start because you didn't give it. First of all, it's not moderated, right? We don't leave
Yep.
the moderators at the table. We basically say the space is yours. And that makes some people feel uncomfortable because they don't know, they think there's like a right or a wrong way to do things. And yet it's so beautiful to see how when people are left to their own devices, how they intuitively go to a place that they might not have if they had been led, asked a leading question, or if there was an expert who was left at the table. And I think that that's also one of the things that we're trying to look at is we're trying to get people at the table who aren't pundits, who don't have canned language, because I think that's another thing that we're all a bit frustrated with. We hear a lot of stock phrases in the media, ideological things that we associate with one side or the other. And it feels like we're never getting beyond those stock phrases. And I think we're trying to find a way to open up the space so that people can create new language, so that they can ask their own questions, and maybe voices of people who have been too timid to come to the public arena. We can get some of those voices to the table. And I think that's, you know, based on what I've read by what you do, I know that you have experts, like we have professional actors perform the voices, but the voices themselves might not have made it into the public arena if we hadn't given them that invitation to express themselves.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And we often will get professional writers who reach out to us because they've come across the model and they'll say, oh, I find this really interesting. I think I would love to be a writer on a project. And sometimes that works out. But unfortunately, what I find, sometimes people who don't identify as writers, maybe they're a nurse or maybe they're a bus driver, but they have the story to tell around this particular topic that we're covering.
Yep.
We train them on the writing model. We talk about asking tough questions and all of that. We don't give them the questions, as I mentioned, but oftentimes those are the richer stories. If somebody's coming in and they're like, oh, I just want to talk to this person and write their story, that doesn't always translate in the best way. And so I find selecting non-writers to sit down together to have these conversations and write each other's story is sometimes the best. And to your point, then being on stage, I remember when we did have a monologue event for one of our topics, I remember this woman was watching her story be performed on stage. And this particular one was not about polarization, but rather was about surviving cancer. And she said, I never imagined when I was battling breast cancer that someday I would be sitting in the community theater in my hometown and watch an actress portray my story on stage. And it's those moments where it's like, yes, like this is exactly what.
For sure, it's so empowering for people to see their story heightened and rendered poetic just in the telling of it and just in the echo that is found by an audience being in front of it. We did a play a long time ago where the central character was actually a taxi driver, an Algerian taxi driver. And the author just took a lot of trips with him and kind of recorded his experiences, you know, moving around Montreal and having different people in his car. And he came to the premiere and at the end of the night was like dancing in the lobby at the premiere party. And he was just saying like, it's the first time I ever saw myself as a hero.
Oh my gosh.
And it was just so, it's like, I feel like sometimes we put kind of artists in one box and ordinary people. And it's like, no, it's all about making connections between people and kind of liberating stories from these black boxes where they exist, where they could teach us so much and finding an opportunity to share them. And in a way, the actors and the writers and directors are just facilitators. Certainly in the case of documentary theater, we're facilitators to kind of bring those stories onto a stage so that we can hear diverse things. But I want to ask you something about diversity, because one thing that I find is very difficult, like we have this ambition with the assembly to get the left and the right, and everything in between on stage, but the theater is pigeonholed as a left-wing arena.
Yeah.
I just wonder, in your experience, if you've had any success bringing a more diverse audience or kind of group of storytellers together, so you feel that we're kind of achieving that balance in perspective.
We certainly try, but in my experience, I do find that most of our folks show up to the spaces probably more left-leaning politically. And we try our hardest to bring in folks who have different political ideas or ideologies. It's hard because you're absolutely right. I think on the surface, people see us and they automatically lump us into the arts, into writing, into theater. And that in itself, for whatever reason, is not political. But somehow people have lumped the arts into, the box of those who are left leaning. And
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting question because I've not quite cracked. How do we get beyond that? And I don't know, have you had any good experience, or do you still find too that it's mostly
tough.
Yeah.
It's tough. I mean, that was also one of the reasons the assembly existed, because we figured each time we do a table, there are two people who identify as right-leaning at the table. And so, first of all, those voices are in the room. And then very often the real people come to see the play and they'll invite their friends and family and work colleagues. And so we have had a few moments where we felt that there was like at least a little clique in the theater who identified. And you can kind of hear the way that the laughter goes too as the play is going on. Okay, who are people identifying with, and who are people judging or whatever. But we had a couple of long tables where people got up to the table and identified with the right-leaning characters. And at one moment in Ottawa, where actually one guy almost felt like he was going to get booed off the stage. And I felt terrible about that, because I felt that I could feel the gang in the theater, the ideological mob, who, even though the play, I think, was kind of inviting them to be curious about that point of view, they just couldn't hold, they were triggered. And they felt that we shouldn't give over the space to people who have certain opinions. And one other experience we had, which was very difficult, was that we had a national newspaper called the Globe and Mail in Canada who reviewed the assembly and said we never should have invited the right-wing character to the stage, because she was, in the opinion of this news article, Islamophobic and had completely intolerant ideas. And there were aspects of Islamophobia in her point of view. But basically, accused us of propagating hate speech. And that just made me realize too, how the media also has its bias. And there are lots of opinions about who should be tolerated in the public discussion and who shouldn't. And that's alienating a lot of people and making them very angry. And I understand that reaction. We have to be careful. But it became a big ethical debate around the project.
Yeah. It makes me think about, in our earlier discussions, and we have a question that's also has come in that relates to this a bit. I did, looking at the political ideology side or where folks fall, I ran into that with my own father, who is a right-leaning Trump supporter here in the US. He grew up in Missouri, in the middle of nowhere in Missouri. And I'm not. I mean, just, this isn't about politics, but I'll identify and say I'm pretty left-leaning American. And, seeing eye to eye, I decided to put my own self into action of what I was encouraging other people to do. And I went on a road trip with my dad at the height of the 2016 election to his hometown, while we were navigating the Trump versus Clinton battle for the presidency.
That is so courageous.
And that became my memoir. And I know you've shared with me a little bit about your own relationship with your mother as well. And I guess I'll just add, with my own father and walking through his shoes and going back to his hometown to see what made him who he is today, why he may think the way he does. I had to go through that journey to truly understand him. And because he's my dad, I wasn't willing to give up on him. So many people are like, I'm cutting this person out of my life. I wasn't willing to do that, but I've gotten so much pushback since my memoirs come out from even some of my left-leaning friends or book reviewers who have said this book should have never been written. This is a really
Yep.
dangerous time to put a book out like this. I don't know if you want to speak some about your mom, but the question too that came in, who are some people in our personal lives who have likely influenced the reason why we do the work we do?
Mhm. So yeah, I mean, we discovered that when we spoke to each other before doing this event, that we have that in common. My mother, who's 84 now, who's, well, actually born in Estonia, and very influenced by the politics of the Soviet Union, of Russia, and the communism there. She escaped during World War II and ended up in Canada in the 1950s. So has always been very suspicious of socialism in any of its forms. And she has, I would say, since the sort of arrival of Donald Trump on the scene, become a huge fan of his, and a kind of quite vocally Republican. She spends a certain amount of time in Florida, but she's still a Canadian citizen, so she doesn't vote. And part of the reason I was inspired to work on the assembly is because I found that discourse in my own family was breaking down. We have a huge tradition in our household of speaking across our differences. And we've always had different political points of view, my brothers and I, and my mother and father, but we always overcame those in the past. And yet it seemed that in 2015, 16, our political conversations started to get very personal. And there were often moments when somebody would just storm off in the middle of a conversation. Like we no longer had tolerance. And I wondered, why is that happening in my household? And then of course, looking around, I'm like, I'm starting to see more symptoms of this in the wider society. So what has changed? What has brought us to this place? And if, spaces for public discourse are starting to break down, maybe the theater needs to come into that void and provide a space where we're able to speak to one another. And yet, I also had similar feedback that you did to your memoir, Hillbilly Queer, that maybe the sort of ethics of that were problematic to try and occupy a middle ground, when maybe actually the opposite is needed. It's time to figure out what you stand for and get up and hold a position at this time. And so I understand, and that was something we tried to have a dialogue with, but I still feel very, very strongly that if you do not maintain contact with people, that sunshine is the best disinfectant, that we have to keep the dialogue open, the channels of dialogue open. If not, we are really going to move towards violence. But it doesn't mean that when you're in the public space and you disagree with someone, that you don't take the opportunity to vocally express that. And I think that's where we go wrong. Sometimes we say oh, let's just keep an open dialogue and everyone's very polite. I think we have to confront each other. I think if somebody says something we disagree with, respectfully say, I think, you're full of shit, respectfully. And this is why. And it doesn't mean I don't like you, because there's a difference between disagreeing with someone and thinking they're a bad person. And I just think, yes, if someone acts on their belief in a violent way, but we have the means to police that, but we should try not to overly police public dialogue, because if we lose that space, then all we have left is violence.
Yeah, I completely agree. And we end up in echo chambers, which is already happening. And we're just hearing views and thoughts of people who think exactly like us. So we never stop and ask ourselves a question about, are we 100% accurate on everything that we're doing? And I think in discussions that I found with my father, which people will often laugh about this because they're like, no way, family is the last place to have a discussion. But I actually find family is the easiest intersection into tough conversations if you feel safe and you have that kind of relationship with your family or your parents.
Yes.
And so with my own dad, I would ask him questions and I would say something like, well, based on my experience as a gay man, this is why I think X, Y, and Z and what I'm concerned about. But I also need to return that listener ear that he provided me so that I can understand why he has the viewpoints. And somewhere in that dialogue, we have to find points of intersection where we can say, oh, okay, I understand now. And like you said, I may not totally agree, but I'm kind of understanding where you're coming from. And in my situation, I'll sometimes try to bring my dad along to my side and he'll do the same. And I
Yes,
think that's human nature.
that's totally natural, of
Yeah.
course. But I think that it's like maybe we just need to focus more on the process, like not feel that every public conversation has to reach some resolution. I
Yeah.
think that the acting out of conflict in the public space, again, if it's respectful and it remains on the level of ideas where we don't become tribal about it and we don't attach so much of our identity to it, I think it's important. It's kind of like sport. When you go to watch a hockey game, it'd be kind of boring, if there were no checks and, no penalties or whatever. But we have referees to police that. But let's let the competition of ideas play out. It provides a very good game. For me, it's a way to innovate in ideas. If you have difference clashing, it allows new ideas to be born that are better. And it allows all of us to become stronger in how we position ourselves. But the process is important to play out. And just because we maintain the contact. And I think that, again, this is why I work in theater, because theater is always reminding ourselves that the most important act of any play is just people showing up in the same space, agreeing to breathe the same air and listen to the same story, maybe come away with very different points of view about the story. And hopefully the story itself will present different points of view. But it allows us to keep community concrete. And it's funny, I was listening to this really interesting French academic or philosopher today who was saying, we've become shadows to each other, like silhouettes. We've reduced everybody to kind of extremes. And where there's no longer nuance in the way that we listen to each other, understand each other, and expect each other to speak. And so it's just a battle royale between extremes. And none of us actually, or very few of us, are very extreme. We can be contradictory. We can be kind of ambiguous. We can have strong opinions about one thing and then a surprising opinion on another issue. And I think that's what I want to kind of get back to the spirit of in humanity, is the kind of giving people the benefit of the doubt and being curious about how multi-layered we all are.
Yeah, and I think some of that too has just been lost in the past few years with our presence on social media. And obviously too, the pandemic has compounded that. So everything is virtual, we're online, we're posting on social media. And while that has a space and can be good, I too have found it's that in-person human interaction that we're least likely to say something really nasty to someone in person if we have to actually sit down and, as you said, go through a humanics approach of having a conversation.
Yep.
It's completely different. And so this face-to-face interaction through the arts, through theater, through writing, absolutely, I feel like is the path forward for us to move to where we need to be and not stay in the space of you're my enemy and I'm going to fight you to the end.
For sure. Well, how about
what is that? Right.
Yeah. With your dad, did you find like what were the moments that allowed you to listen, and then what were the moments where there was still a complete obstacle there?
Yeah, my dad loves history and he loves storytelling as well. So there's almost that natural connection. But his storytelling, he loves to talk about family history. And I find it interesting. So in those moments, we're just having conversations about things that we both love. When I would find the conversations to move toward difficulty would be when we were in the hotel room and he would just watch Fox News constantly. And I would say, oh, is there something else we can watch? And oh, no, I want to see, like Donald Trump's coming up and he's getting ready to give a speech about, X, Y, and Z. And I would just feel this tension because even though my dad wasn't dismissing me in any way, there were feelings I had about what Donald Trump represented, and especially the person he ended up choosing as his vice president, who I knew held very homophobic views. And so it was hard for me not to feel like in those moments that it wasn't an screw you to me.
For sure.
So those were the moments where I had to try to divert the conversation or say, hey, can we go get breakfast, or can we move him back to that place where we could get away and have a conversation. But eventually we had to confront
Yes, you had to go there.
our
Did
differences.
did he know that you were going to write a memoir about this experience as you were traveling together? So that's something you decided to do after, because it was so compelling, the conversations you had.
I did. I kept notes because being a writer, I always have a moleskin with me, and writing is an act of reflection, really. And I took my own notes for reflection on what does this mean? And like I said, I was putting my own work into motion by, well, if I'm expecting other people through my art to connect across difference, why can't I do that with my own father at this moment in time? And I really was not expecting to write a memoir, but I just had so much through my reflection that I started putting it down on the page. And it's like, with art, it's like, what do I do with this? And how do I move this around? And wait, this is turning into something. Is this something I'm just going to keep on, saved in a file and go back to remind myself, like, okay, this is my dad and we do love each other? Or is there a bigger story here, a deeper vein to mine that perhaps others in this moment in time can see themselves in the story?
For
And that's
sure.
what I love about writing and I love about theater is
Yeah.
people in that moment while they're experiencing the art, whether they're reading it or holding the book or they're watching it on stage, people see themselves reflected in some way,
For
either
sure. That's why
positively or negatively.
we often use the word a mirror, holding a mirror up to society. And, it's less invention and it's more that act of observation that allows us to see more clearly, because the moment we see it, we don't just blurt it out. We then take time to ponder it and invite other artists around the table to ask what they see in that thing that we've documented. And then, as you say, the moment you bring it to the audience, it becomes something else. For the assembly, like I mentioned before, it's not one play, it's not one documentary play or one event. It's a project that Alex and Brett, my co-creators, we always saw happening over time. So like in the same way that, you were on this voyage with your dad and taking notes and then you reflected on it. Every time we do one of these real suppers with the real people, it's almost like we're taking a Polaroid and then we're just like putting that up on the wall and we're saying, okay, in this moment, in Munich in 2018, this is what these people said about polarization. Now let's compare it to what people in Maryland said in 2019. Let's compare how people are polarized in Germany versus the United States versus in Canada. And let's look at the language. Let's write down word for word all this language, put it on the page, and take the time to consider, like, what are the mechanics of polarization? And it's amazing, like, how each step is just such a learning process for us. And then the moment we bring it to the audience, it's like it's always evolving in time. And we know that it's going to take time to address polarization. It's not going to happen overnight. We're probably in this for a while, in this muck
Yes.
as a society. And a lot of people are asking the question, how are we going to emerge out of it? I hope it won't be through any kind of civil. Well, we've already seen a lot of civil unrest. I hope it won't get worse. But I think that as artists, we need to have the confidence to say, we do have some of the keys to keep the fabric of society intact. Like, and not, I think sometimes we dismiss artists as kind of being marginal, like we're kind of like having fun in a sandbox in the corner, as opposed to kind of taking center stage in our society and really like confronting people with like what reality is looking like and asking them to work with us to keep it all together, keep coming back. Well, as we say with the assembly, keep coming back to the table.
Yeah. And I find the arts now are more important than ever. And I also find, going back to the comparisons of this happened in Munich and this year and then this other place, I was surprised. It was never one of our intentions when we started the work was, we had a university library reach out to us and say, we want to archive all of your work because 50 years from now, people are going to look back at this and read, and it will really tell a story about what was happening in this moment in time. And are you kind of finding that too in the comparisons from city to city around these conversations?
Yes, and we really hope one day we could do some kind of mini festival where we put some of them together so that people can experience, do like a marathon evening to compare. Of course, we're working with different languages. We've had some in French, some in English, some in German. Now we're working in Portuguese, and that's the other fun of it. Is obviously we can't write those projects that happen outside of English or French, so we have to collaborate with local artists, sort of train them in the way that we've created these assemblies. And then we get their feedback about how the sort of platform serves their community. And another thing that's happened is we've had some interest from some television producers in Montreal. During COVID, one of our assemblies that was done in Montreal in French was filmed for television. And so we got it out to a wider audience. And a really wonderful result of one of those is that a school teacher who works at a big public school north of Montreal saw the assembly on television. And he said, I'd love to use this platform for my students because I'm feeling like teenagers these days, because they spend so much time on social media and they're living through a lot, especially with COVID right now. Getting them to use the assembly platform to have discussions at school and then performing those for the school community to get a conversation going. That was very validating for us. And, I wonder if for you too, like I know that you've worked with partners at NPR, for example, because you're trying to get your method and the stories out to a wider audience. It sounds like it's resonating beyond the borders that you first imagined when you started the project.
Yeah, I mean, we started it here in our hometown in Indiana and never imagined that it would grow into what it did. But I think that just shows that people are hungry for conversations and trying to understand each other across difference. And there's nothing that I love more, and you could probably relate to it. There are times where people don't think about this with artists, but sometimes we get bogged down with the paperwork and just everything that goes into putting a production on or putting a book out. And in those moments, I'm always like, I know this is important, but why are we doing this again?
Yes.
But then when I get that email or someone sends me a message on social media and they said, I heard the story today on NPR, or I went and saw the performance in Chicago or whatever. And it changed me. It really did move me. And thank you. Those are those moments when I remember this is why we do it. And I always have to just keep thinking about that.
It's true. And it's been so hard for us as a performing arts company over the past 18 months, just not to have the, that physical face-to-face encounter with the audience. I mean, we've come up with some digital versions of the assembly just to kind of keep momentum going. And as I mentioned, we did that television project. And so we did get the emails, or sometimes a phone call, but it's also when people rush up to you after a play in the moment to say, that moment when that character said that to that person and they got triggered, and that happens, at my workplace every day, or, and they thank you for coming up with something that allows them to identify not just what other people are doing wrong, but what they're doing. One thing I'll say just visually about the assembly is on stage, it takes place around an oval table. And so there's 6 actors on stage, the 2 moderators, my colleagues, Alex and Brett, and the 4 participants who are played by actors. And each one of them has a small camera in front of them, and the image of their face is projected on a screen above the table. It's almost like a Jumbotron in sports events. So you get a close-up of each person's face while they're having this very heated conversation about an issue that they're all very divided over. So what you get to see is you get to watch the real actors, but then you can also go up and look individually at, while one person's talking, how the other person is listening. And a lot of our audience comes away and says, what I learned the most today, or like what entertained me the most tonight, was like watching people listen, and how we're so terrible at, like, when one person says something, all we're doing is like preparing how we're going to rebut that person. And when we do come back and say something, we're often not addressing what that person said. So if you compare that to a tennis match, it's like one person's serving and it's just like ace after ace after ace. And then the next person's saving ace after ace. It's a terrible game, right?
Yes. Yeah.
The best exchanges is where we actually like pick up where someone left off and then come back. But again, we've become very out of practice when it comes to public discourse. And, but, you know, I just say that because I think that it's more than just about talking and being divided. It's just like, how are we receiving one another?
Yeah, listening is truly an art, and it's an art that has been forgotten. And people need to re-practice that art, because art, as you know, takes time. It takes time to perfect. It takes time to get how we want things to function on stage or on the page. And listening is the same. And you're absolutely right. We've forgotten how to listen to one another because we are waiting for our turn to speak.
Yeah. Well, and it's, as you said, like it's silent, right? And it's funny because we often think of listening as being passive, because we're giving up the floor, you know, we're allowing someone else to come in, and we assume that in the battle of conversation, you're only very effective if you can kind of get in there, move in there and interrupt and be aggressive. And yet, you know, with dialogue, really, if no one's listening, there is no dialogue, right? We shouldn't even really call it dialogue anymore. It should just be like, I don't know, communal monologue.
talking at each other.
Exactly. So anyway, there's a lot of fun. I mean, it's also very funny when you see that, because it's kind of just social breakdown. And that's pretty much what all playwrights are like. If you look at all the big, you know, interesting modern dramas, it's all about family breakdown, societal breakdown. And we're just taking a look at it, hoping that we can come away with maybe more sensitivity to that.
Yes. Yeah. There have been a couple of questions that have come in that I want to make sure that we get to. So David O'Fallon asked, were either of us informed at all by the living theater of the late 60s and 70s? Some of our techniques, listening, taking voices from people and engaging the audience in conversation, is similar. Are there threads there that we took from the living theater?
Gosh, I'm so embarrassed because I remember learning about the living theater when I was studying theater at Princeton, and seeing, I think, some on video, but I'm ashamed to say that I can't actually right now in the moment remember. I feel like it's like Judith somebody, but it's not something that I cite as being one of my inspirations. Certainly, like, I've been inspired by all kinds of theater, but I was very particularly inspired by documentary artists. So I mentioned two. The other one was Moises Kaufman, who many of you might have heard of the Laramie Project, which I believe was very successful and maybe even made into a movie at one point. And there's some European theater, the plays of Peter Weiss, who did The Investigation, which was a recording of, or verbatim extracts of the Nuremberg trial, which were sculpted into a piece of theater and performed in like multiple cities simultaneously in Germany. I guess about a decade after a World War II. But no, I'm sorry to say that the living theater is not one of my inspirations, and I remain quite ignorant about their work.
And same for me. I am not overly familiar with the living theater. Our work was inspired by Studs Terkel, who put out many first-person accounts of interviews that he did with individuals across the US. But mainly during the Great Depression, he traveled across the country and captured the stories of those who were living in Middle America. And that inspired the work that we did at the Facing Project. We never intended it to grow into all of these different aspects that it just did. And we're thankful that it did grow into those ways organically. But we were really inspired by the work of Studs Terkel, and we wanted to recreate what that may look like in modern day, but having two people sit down and tell each other stories.
Thank you for the question, because I'm now very intrigued to go back and learn a little bit more about the living theater and how they use, like, leverage the space of the theater to create conversation between the audience. And I imagine it was quite political. And I think it started in New York. Was Richard Schechner part of that? Anyway, gosh, I feel like now I have no contact with the person asking the question, but please feel free to reach out to me by email to continue the conversation if you'd like.
And we have another question that's come in, and I'm reading it. It's from Mr. Mojo. As a documentary film producer, I unexpectedly found the camera turned around on me when a filmmaker I wrote a score for shocked me by doing a film about my life and career. It was a mind-blowing reversal that shook me to my core. JR has done an autobiography, but have either of you experienced that reversal to subject? If so, how do you feel? If not, how do you think you'd feel? And that's from Mojo and the Bio Gypsies.
Well, so in the assembly, I'm not a character on stage, but in some of my earlier works like Seeds, The Watershed, Freddie. Well, Freddie, I'm not incarnated on the stage, but because I'm not an actress, I'm a playwright, but I record myself interviewing other people. And then there's, in those plays that I cited, Seeds and The Watershed, an actress plays me on the stage. And I found that was actually something I did later on in my career, and a director that I worked with, Chris Abraham at Crow's Theatre in Toronto, encouraged me to do that because he said, you know, if the playwright herself is made more human, less authoritative, and we can see her in moments when she is vulnerable next to her interview subjects, he felt that that gave more space for the audience to come in and relate to the documentary story. And so there are moments in Seeds in the Watershed where I do train the camera on myself. I'm still in charge of that camera because I'm ultimately the one deciding what stays in the script and what doesn't. However, I did feel that gave me an opportunity to experience the vulnerability of being a documentary subject. There was a controversy around one of the plays that I wrote called Freddie in Montreal, in which I gave one of the characters who played himself on the stage license to criticize me. And that's where the play leaves off, is a complete denunciation of a white woman who's writing a play about racial profiling in Montreal North. And so I feel like I found ways to allow the camera to take a shot of me and my faults and my blind spots. And that's actually helped my writing. But beyond that, I've never been a true subject of someone else's documentary. And I imagine that would be mind-blowing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, for us, I will say that taking myself out of it for a moment, we never publish any of the stories or bring them to stage without any of the storytellers 100% signing off and agreeing to their story being shared in that way. And if there is any question, we never put it in print or on stage or put them on the airwaves. I did participate in one facing project as a listener, writer, and storyteller, and it was an LGBTQ project. And I did not love the story that was written about me at first. So it was a moment where I was like, oh wait, no, this isn't how the story should be.
Mm-hmm.
And it was that kind of aha moment where I thought to myself, like, oh boy, I've never thought about this, but this must be exactly what happens to the other storytellers, which I'm standing back as a writer and thinking, yes, this is perfect. This is the moment of the norming, storming, forming that happens in these conversations. But then when I was in that seat, I was like, oh no, wait.
Yes.
But I had to have that moment and then just go through the process. And I'm really glad that I did. I will say, though, that my mom did appear in that story, and she wasn't necessarily happy with the way that she was portrayed in the story, and I hadn't run it by her. So then you have to sometimes think about, are there other characters or subjects that appear in these conversations or stories, and how do we make sure that we're not shining a negative light on them? And so that's kind of an area where I've tried to focus and pay attention to more, to make sure that people who are third parties aren't necessarily viewed in a negative light, or their real names aren't used. And then I'll just add that
And that's a great question, by the way. Thank you for asking that question.
It was a really great question. Let me see if I thought I saw another question pop back up. Okay, so David did say Julian Beck and Judith Molina, I think.
Okay, Judith, I had one name correct. Thank you.
Yeah, Living Theater, very political, international, jailed and imprisoned for their work to give voice to the oppressed. A history and passion to know, so let's honor their work, even as you take us all into our times in new ways. So thank you. Yes, thank you, David, for making us a little wiser in that area, because we both weren't as sure about that. So one last question is, what final advice would we offer to anyone who is trying to have braver conversations in their personal or professional lives, and any key takeaways from our own experiences?
Well, certainly have confidence and conviction in your voice, and particularly in your questions. Like, often when I'm working, when I'm giving workshops or working with students who are interested in learning about documentary theater, the place where we start is just tell me about the questions in your head. Like, we all have these questions, like, why is the world like this? Like, why does that keep happening? Why is education run like this? Like, and sometimes we're not aware. It's like an inner monologue we have. And I'm trying to get people who have those questions in their head to say them publicly, and then find a way to investigate them in a way that they can share the journey of the investigation with a public, and just have the conviction that you can be a very good author and sort of social detective by just following the logic of your questions and finding people out in the world who you can ask your questions of. Again, people often sort of put authors on a pedestal, saying, oh, they must have some magic way to kind of dream up stories. And I kind of just consider myself a curious person who goes out into the world, records the questions that I ask of people, and then bring that back to an audience. So that would be if you have a kind of professional interest. I would say on a personal level, keep being very courageous about meeting people who think differently from you, and don't give up hope that even if it might not change in one conversation, your ability to listen or their ability to receive you, that multiple revisiting with the same person over time, or similar, like, different points of view, I think we can make progress in time. We have to be patient.
I would agree with all of that. And patience is so key. Another piece that we say, it's all about empathy. And so you have to have the courage to share your own story, but at the same time, you have to have the empathy to listen to others. And sometimes we miss out on that, both personally, but professionally. As we were talking about before, we're always waiting to say the next thing. We're not necessarily taking in what others are saying and reflecting on that. We're just jumping in. And I like to always look at everyone as they are, a human. And we all have flaws. None of us are perfect. And all of us come to where we are in this present day because of our own lived experience. And our lived experiences aren't the same. And so just showing up in spaces and knowing that we're interacting with each other as humans, I think, is a really beautiful thing that we need to embrace. And I think that we have to have the courage to share our story and how we are, why we are the way we are. But we have to have that empathetic ear to listen to others who maybe are different. So empathy is a key piece.
For sure.
And I think Kareth, is jumping back on. And Annabel, I just want to thank you. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much, JR. It's been a pleasure meeting you as we prepared for this, and I really enjoyed our talk tonight.
Yes, same.
And thank you both, JR and Annabel, for a powerful and thoughtful discussion this evening. As I mentioned at the top of the conversation, this is the first of a series of programs Arts Midwest will be hosting. And Annabel will be back in October to discuss further the assembly and how to approach creating new episodes here in the Midwest. Thank you to Michael at Arts Midwest for his behind the scenes work in developing this project and his technical assistance tonight. He was Arts Midwest, if for any of you who were engaging with him over the Zoom conference tonight, as well as everyone at Arts Midwest for producing tonight's event. Thank you again to JR and Annabel for the robust conversation, and thank you all for attending tonight's discussion. Bonne soirée.